My husband left before sunrise that morning, his truck headlights cutting across the cedar trees as he backed down the gravel drive. Work had taken him out of town for 3 nights. I had done this routine many times. Lock the doors, set the alarm, bring the dog in before dark. The house sat on 5 acres in the Texas Hill Country, far enough from the nearest paved road that nights felt bigger and darker than they did in town. The land behind the house sloped down into a shallow draw filled with live oaks, cedar, and thick brush. A 6-foot wire fence ran around the backyard, more to keep our dog in than to keep anything out. We had always trusted it. Nothing larger than a deer had ever tested it. The day passed quietly. Wind moved through the trees. By evening the air had cooled, and the smell of dry grass and dust settled over everything. I kept the back porch light on as the sun went down. Our dog, Ranger, a 70-pound mixed shepherd, spent most evenings outside, moving along the fence line, checking his usual paths. He normally came running the second I opened the back door. Around midnight, I finished cleaning the kitchen and turned off the television. The house felt still in the way it does when you are the only person inside. I checked the locks again and set the alarm to night mode. Ranger was still outside. That was normal. He liked to patrol after dark. At 12:40 a.m., I opened the back door and called him in. He was standing 10 feet from the porch, facing the trees beyond the fence. His body was stiff. His tail was low but not tucked. A deep growl rolled from his chest, the kind he never used during play or when strangers came to the front gate. I called again. He didn't move. The porch light reached him, but the yard beyond that fell into heavy shadow. I stepped out onto the concrete and whistled, expecting him to trot over like always. He turned his head toward me for a moment. His eyes looked wide and bright. Then he backed away from the porch. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Ranger loved being inside at night. He slept near the back door and never resisted coming in. I walked down the 2 porch steps and moved toward him slowly, keeping my voice calm. He backed up again, still facing the trees, still growling. His attention wasn't on me. It was fixed on something behind the fence. The air felt different out there. Still but heavy. No insects, no movement in the brush. The wind had stopped. I stopped about 5 feet from him and reached for his collar. He flinched and stepped sideways, putting space between us and keeping his eyes on the same spot beyond the yard. Then he shifted position so that I was between him and the house. That was the second thing that felt wrong. He wasn't refusing to come inside. He was refusing to turn his back on whatever he was watching. I straightened and looked out toward the fence line. The porch light didn't reach that far. The trees beyond it formed a dark wall. I couldn't see movement, but the feeling that something was there came on quickly and stayed. Ranger's growl deepened. The hair along his back stood up. Then I heard it. A slow, heavy movement through brush. Not quick steps. Not the light cracking of a deer. This sounded like weight pushing through cedar branches, deliberate and steady. I froze. The sound moved parallel to the fence, maybe 20 yards out. Ranger followed it with his head, pacing sideways but never turning away. I stepped backward toward the porch. Every instinct said to get inside, but I didn't want to turn my back either. The darkness beyond the yard felt thick, like it was holding something large. The movement stopped. Silence again. No wind. No insects. Ranger's growl stopped too, but he stayed rigid, staring. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then something hit the fence. Not a crash. Not a full impact. More like a heavy body brushing along it with force. The metal wire vibrated. I heard the tension hum. Ranger barked once, loud and sharp, then dropped back into a low growl. The sound moved quickly now, running the length of the fence line from left to right. It was fast, but still heavy. Branches snapped. Brush flattened. Whatever it was moved with purpose and didn't hesitate. I grabbed Ranger's collar and pulled hard. This time he came with me, but he kept looking over his shoulder the entire way to the porch. I got him inside and shut the door immediately, locking the deadbolt even though the alarm was already set. We both stood there in the kitchen, breathing hard. Ranger went straight to the back door and stared out through the glass, growling again. I turned off the porch light so I could see outside better. At first there was nothing, just the outline of the yard and the darker shape of the trees. Then I saw movement at the far end of the fence. A shape passed through the shadows, low and long, moving along the wire. I couldn't make out details, only size and motion. It wasn't a deer. It stayed close to the ground and moved smoothly, without the stop-and-go pattern of grazing animals. It reached the corner of the yard, paused for a moment, then slipped into the brush and disappeared. Ranger stayed at the door for the next hour, alert and silent. I didn't sleep. I kept the house lights off and watched the yard from the kitchen. Nothing else came back. At first light, I went outside. The air smelled like crushed cedar. Ranger stayed close to my leg, which he never did during morning routines. The fence looked normal until I reached the far right corner. One section had been pushed inward. The metal posts were bent toward the yard at about chest height. The wire had stretched and bowed several inches inside the line. Cedar branches on the outside were broken and flattened, forming a path through the brush. I measured the height later against my husband's shoulder. Whatever leaned or hit that fence had weight and mass behind it. We called a local wildlife officer that afternoon. He walked the area and found tracks in the softer soil beyond the trees. Large, round prints with claw marks. He pointed out crushed grass and a faint trail running along the property line. His explanation was simple. A large feral hog, likely a boar, moving through its range at night. Mature boars in that area could weigh over 300 pounds. Quiet when they wanted to be. Strong enough to bend fencing without slowing down. He also said something that stayed with me. If a dog refuses to come inside, it isn't being stubborn. It's reading something you can't see yet. We reinforced the fence with steel posts and heavier wire. Motion lights went up along the back line. Since then, Ranger still patrols at night, but he comes inside the moment I open the door. Sometimes, when the wind dies and the trees go silent, he stands at the glass and watches the darkness beyond the yard. He doesn't growl anymore. He just watches. December 2016 was cold in a steady, quiet way. The kind of cold that stayed after sunset and made the whole neighborhood feel sealed off. Our street in Edison was a loop of two-story houses, trimmed lawns now stiff with frost, and parked cars that didn't move much after dark. Most families had lived there for years. Nothing unusual ever happened. My parents were out of town for 4 days visiting relatives in Chicago. I stayed behind because of school and to keep an eye on the house. I was used to being alone in the evenings. I locked the doors, kept the lights on, and followed a routine that made the house feel normal. That night I finished dinner around 9. The dishwasher was running. The television was on in the living room. The house felt warm and steady. Outside, the streetlights cast pale circles on the pavement. No wind, no traffic, just the quiet hum that comes with winter. At 9:20 p.m., everything went dark. The television cut off first, then the dishwasher stopped mid-cycle. The furnace went silent. The sudden quiet was the worst part. When power fails at night, the house feels empty in a way that doesn't feel natural. My first thought was a neighborhood outage. I went to the front window and pulled the curtain back. The streetlights were still on. The houses across the street were lit. Christmas lights blinked on 2 front yards. Nothing else had gone dark. Only our house. That changed the feeling immediately. I checked the circuit panel inside the basement. Nothing had tripped. Every breaker was in the normal position. That meant the issue was outside. Our main shutoff box was mounted on the exterior wall near the side of the house, close to the driveway. I put on a jacket, grabbed my phone for light, and stepped outside. The air felt sharper than I expected. The driveway was empty except for my parents' car. Frost had started forming along the edges of the lawn. I walked along the side of the house and opened the metal panel. The main switch had been flipped to off. For a second I assumed my father had shut it off before leaving, but that didn't make sense. We had power all day. I pushed the switch back up. The house came alive behind me. Lights turned on. The furnace started again. I stayed outside for a moment, looking around. The street was quiet. No movement, no sound except a distant car somewhere beyond the block. Then I noticed a vehicle parked about 5 houses down. It was facing toward the exit of the loop, sitting along the curb. No headlights. No interior lights. The engine might have been off, or just quiet enough that I couldn't hear it. It wasn't a car I recognized, but that alone didn't mean much. People visited. Still, something about the way it sat there felt deliberate. Parked just far enough to see most of the street. I went back inside and locked the door. The house returned to normal. Lights on. Heat running. The interruption felt like a minor problem that had been solved. I tried to settle back into my routine, but I kept thinking about the switch being off. Breaker boxes don't turn themselves. 10 minutes later, the power went out again. This time I didn't move right away. I stood in the living room, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light coming from the street through the windows. My phone showed the time, 9:34. I walked to the front window and looked outside again. The street was still lit. The other houses still had power. The same car was still there. I didn't go outside immediately. Instead, I walked through the house and checked every door and window. All locked. I turned off the interior lights that had come back earlier and left only the front porch light on. Then I went back to the side door and stepped out. The metal panel was open. I was sure I had closed it the first time. The main switch was down again. I flipped it back up. As I did, I felt the same awareness I'd had earlier, but stronger. The sense of being watched. I looked down the street. The car had not moved. I went inside faster this time and locked both the side and front doors. I didn't sit down again. I stayed near the front window, standing just out of sight, looking through a narrow gap in the curtain. 5 minutes passed. Nothing moved. Then the porch light went dark. The power had been cut again. I did not go outside. Instead, I turned off every light inside the house that had come back earlier and stayed in darkness. I crouched near the window and watched the street. After about a minute, the parked car's brake lights flickered once, then went dark again. That was when I called the police. I gave my address and explained that someone had shut off my exterior power multiple times and that a car had been sitting down the street since it started. I stayed on the line while watching the road. About 6 minutes later, headlights appeared at the entrance to the loop. The parked car started immediately. Its engine sound carried clearly now. It pulled away before the police vehicle even turned onto the street. The police cruiser circled once, then stopped in front of our house. 2 officers checked the exterior panel. The switch was down again. They stayed for a while, taking notes and looking at the tire tracks where the other car had been parked. One of them walked the length of the street with a flashlight. The power was restored and left on. I didn't sleep much that night. The next afternoon, an officer came back to speak with my parents over the phone and to update me. Over the previous 2 weeks, several homes in nearby neighborhoods had reported similar incidents. Power cut at the exterior box. Someone waiting nearby. In one case, a homeowner had stepped outside alone and been approached before neighbors came out. The pattern was simple. Cut power. Watch. See who comes out. See who is alone. The car I saw matched a vehicle connected to those reports. It had not been caught yet, but patrols were increased in the area. My parents had a locking cover installed over the exterior panel the day they returned. For weeks after that, I noticed how exposed the outside of a house really is. How easy it is for someone to stand at the edge of a quiet street and watch without being noticed. The neighborhood still looked the same, calm and familiar, but the feeling had changed. Nothing else happened to our house. But every winter night after that, when the street went quiet and the windows reflected only darkness, I always checked the lights outside before assuming the power would stay on. In October 2020, I had the house to myself for a week. My roommates drove out of state to see their families. I stayed behind because I could not get time off work. The place was an old rental with thin walls and uneven floors. It had a narrow hallway that ran from the living room to the bedrooms. In the middle of that hallway, there was a square attic hatch set into the ceiling. It had a small metal ring hanging from it. I had lived there for almost a year and had never seen it opened. The house always made noise. Wood shifted when the temperature dropped at night. Pipes ticked after someone used hot water. Squirrels ran across the roof in the mornings. I never felt uneasy about it before. There were 3 of us in the house most of the time. Noise felt normal when other people were around. The first night alone, I stayed up late watching a movie. Around 1 in the morning, I heard a dull scraping sound above the hallway ceiling. It was faint, slow, like something dragging across wood. I paused the television and listened. It stopped. I waited a full minute. Nothing. I told myself it was a raccoon, or maybe a loose branch rubbing the roof. The attic had no proper flooring, just beams and insulation. Animals got into places like that all the time. I went to bed and tried to ignore it. My bedroom was at the end of the hallway, directly under part of the attic. The ceiling in my room had a small water stain from years ago. I remember staring at that stain as I tried to fall asleep. The house felt larger without the usual background noise of other people. Every small sound stood out. The next night I heard it again. This time it was later, closer to 1 in the morning. I had already turned off the lights. I was half asleep when I heard slow movement above me. Not the quick scurry of an animal. It sounded measured. A shift of weight. A soft thud. Then stillness. I held my breath to listen. After a few seconds, there was a faint exhale. It was steady. It had rhythm. I lay there, eyes open in the dark. The sound was directly above my bed. It was not scratching. It was not chewing. It was breathing. Slow, controlled breathing, like someone trying not to make noise. My mind searched for explanations. I thought about wind pushing air through vents. I thought about the furnace. I thought about my own breathing echoing in the room. I held my breath again. The sound continued. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. My chest felt tight. I did not move. I did not turn on the light. I stared at the ceiling stain and counted the breaths. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound shifted slightly, like a knee adjusting on wood. Then it stopped. Total silence. I stayed awake until morning. The next day I told myself stress was making me imagine things. The house was old. Sound carried strangely. I worked all day and tried not to think about it. When I came home that evening, the hallway felt narrower than usual. I looked up at the attic hatch. It looked the same as always. The metal ring hung flat against the wood. I checked the front and back doors. Both were locked. The windows were shut. Nothing looked disturbed. I ate dinner and kept the television on for background noise. Around midnight, I turned everything off and went to bed with my phone in my hand. At 1:03 a.m., I heard movement again. This time it started in the hallway. A slow shift above the ceiling near the attic hatch. Then it moved toward my room. The sound tracked across the beams overhead. It stopped above my bed. The breathing started again. Clearer this time. Inhale through the nose. Exhale through the mouth. Slow and controlled. I opened the recording app on my phone and set it on the nightstand. I did not trust myself to remember the sound correctly. I needed proof. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my breathing steady so it would not drown out the noise. After a few seconds, I raised my fist and knocked on the ceiling 3 times. The drywall was thin. The sound echoed in the room. The breathing stopped instantly. No shift. No scramble. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels deliberate. I lay there for a long time. I did not hear anything else that night. In the morning, I listened to the recording. At first, there was only the faint hum of the room. Then, about 20 seconds in, I heard it. A low inhale. A soft exhale. It was not loud, but it was distinct. When the knocking sound came through, the breathing cut off mid-rhythm. My stomach dropped. I called the landlord and told him I thought there was an animal in the attic. I did not mention breathing. I did not mention the recording. I just said there was movement, and I was worried about damage. He said he would send pest control the next afternoon. I barely slept that night. I kept the lights on in the bedroom. I stayed awake, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint creak in the hallway ceiling. It did not move toward my room this time. It stayed near the attic hatch. I imagined someone lying flat above the insulation, waiting. The next day, pest control arrived. 2 men in uniforms carried a ladder into the hallway. I stood in the living room and watched. They pushed the ladder up to the hatch and pulled the metal ring. The square panel swung down, releasing a puff of stale air. One of them climbed up with a flashlight. I could hear his boots shifting on the beams. Then there was a long pause. He did not say anything at first. The other man asked if he saw droppings or nests. The man in the attic told him to come up. The second man climbed up. I stayed below, staring at the open hatch. Dust floated down in thin lines. After a minute, they both climbed down. One of them looked at me with a flat expression. He told me there were no animals. There were blankets laid out between the beams, food wrappers stuffed into a corner, a plastic grocery bag filled with empty water bottles, a flashlight, a sleeping bag rolled tight against the far wall. The insulation was pressed down in one area where someone had been lying. Someone had been living above my ceiling. The men searched the rest of the attic. No one was there at that moment. They checked the exterior of the house and found that one of the small attic vents near the roofline had been pried loose. It was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. The police were called. They took photos. They collected the items as evidence. I gave them the recording from my phone. They told me cases like this happened more than people realized. Vacant houses, rentals, places where tenants came and went. I moved out that week. I did not sleep in that bedroom again. I stayed with a friend until my roommates returned. When I went back to collect my things, I stood in the hallway and looked up at the patched ceiling. The landlord had sealed the vent and reinforced the hatch with screws. I kept thinking about the breathing, about how close it had been, about the nights when I was asleep and someone was above me, listening to the same quiet house. The space between the ceiling and the roof was less than 3 feet high. The beams ran across every few feet. It was a cramped, dusty cavity filled with fiberglass and old wood. Someone had chosen to lie there, directly over my bed, and breathe in the dark. The police never told me if they caught anyone. I changed my number and stopped checking for updates. I still listen to ceilings when I stay somewhere new. I still notice how sound carries through wood and drywall. The house taught me how thin the barrier is between a room and the space above it. My parents left for my grandmother's place 3 hours north in the late afternoon. I watched their truck disappear down the county road until the red taillights were swallowed by blowing snow. The farmhouse felt larger once they were gone. It always did. The ceilings were high, the walls thick, the floors old and loud. In summer, the place felt open and bright. In January, it felt exposed. The house sat alone on flat land outside a small town in rural Alberta. The nearest neighbor's yard light was half a mile east across 2 empty fields. In daylight, I could see his grain bins and the dark line of spruce behind his barn. At night, there was nothing but wind and the faint hum of power lines. Snow had fallen 2 days earlier, dry and powdery, and the temperature had dropped to -20. The drifts along the fence line were waist-high. No livestock were kept in winter. No dogs roamed. Coyotes sometimes crossed the fields, but not close to the yard and not in that kind of cold. I checked the doors before going to bed. Deadbolts set. Mudroom locked. Windows latched. The wood stove was burning low, just enough to ease the load on the furnace. I left the kitchen light off and the yard lights on. The motion sensor near the back fence covered the stretch between the house and the old barbed wire line that marked the edge of the property. It faced west, toward open land. I woke at 1:47 a.m. to the furnace kicking on. The sound was steady and familiar. I lay there listening to the wind slide along the siding. Then the yard went bright. The motion light flared through the blinds and cast hard lines across my bedroom wall. I sat up and waited for it to go dark again. The sensor sometimes caught blowing snow. After 20 seconds, the light shut off. I lay back down. Less than a minute later, it came on again. That time I got up and went to the window. The glass felt cold against my forehead. I lifted the blind just enough to see out. The yard was white and flat, the snow smooth and unmarked from the back steps to the fence. The light flooded the area in a harsh circle. At the far edge of it, near the fence line, something stood. It was tall, taller than the fence posts, dark against the snow. It was not shaped like a bale, not shaped like a tree, not shaped like any piece of farm equipment. It stood straight. No movement. No bending in the wind. I told myself it was a shadow. The fence posts cast long shapes under that light. I blinked and focused. The object was separate from the posts. It was inside the yard, not beyond it. Maybe 2 feet from the wire. I stayed still, watching for motion. Nothing changed. The light went out again. When it did, the shape vanished into darkness. I stood there for a full minute. My heart was steady but heavy. I told myself it was a trick of depth, a drift, a stack of something I had not noticed earlier. The cold outside would make anything look sharper. The light came on a third time. The shape was still there, in the same place. Straight, narrow, no visible arms, no visible head that I could make out, just a vertical mass darker than the sky. There were no tracks in the snow leading to it. The yard was clean. The snow surface reflected the light like paper. I grabbed my phone and turned on the camera, zoomed in through the glass. The image blurred. Digital grain swallowed detail. I lowered the phone and kept watching with my own eyes. At 2:15 a.m., I checked the time because I needed something exact to hold on to. When I looked up again, the shape was no longer by the fence. It was halfway to the house. It had crossed at least 20 feet of open snow without leaving a single mark that I could see. It stood just beyond the reach of the light, at the edge of the brightness. My mouth went dry. I scanned the ground between the fence and that spot. The snow remained untouched. Then I heard it. A crunch. Slow. Deliberate. The sound came from the side of the house, near the kitchen wall, not from the yard where I had been looking. I turned and moved into the hallway, every board under my feet creaking louder than usual. Another crunch, then another. The sound of boots pressing into packed snow. Measured steps. The motion light shut off again, plunging the yard into black. The footsteps continued. They circled along the west wall toward the front of the house. I did not look out the front window. I stayed back from the glass. I felt exposed even inside. The steps passed the front porch, then along the east wall. Each one spaced far apart, not quick, not rushed. Slow pacing. The sound carried clearly in the cold air. I forced myself to move toward the mudroom and checked the lock with my hand. Solid. I grabbed my coat and keys. I called my neighbor. I did not explain much. I told him something was outside and I needed him there now. He said he was coming. I could hear the engine of his truck starting in the distance within a minute. The footsteps stopped near the back of the house again. I waited. The furnace kicked on once more, drowning everything for a few seconds. When it shut off, the yard was silent. Headlights appeared through the kitchen window, cutting across the field as my neighbor drove straight over the snow rather than following the road. His truck rolled into the yard and idled with beams pointed at the back fence. I stepped onto the porch only after he got out and stood beside his vehicle. The cold hit my lungs hard. The snow under my boots was untouched. We walked to the back fence together, flashlights cutting white paths across the yard. The tracks were there. They started near the fence line where I had first seen the shape. Deep impressions in the snow. Human in outline. Heel and toe clear. The depth suggested weight. Each print was spaced far apart. I measured with my own stride. I had to take 2 steps to match the distance between one set. From the fence to the halfway point where I had seen it later, there were prints. From there to the side of the house, more prints. Along the walls, circling the entire structure, a clean path of them. There had been no tracks when I looked out the window the first time. I am certain of that. The snow had been smooth. The stride length measured just over 6 feet from heel to heel. No running pattern. No slipping. Just long, steady steps. The prints led back toward the field beyond the fence. Past the wire, the pattern continued faintly across the drift until the wind erased it. In daylight, we followed the line into the field. It cut straight toward a shallow ditch that ran parallel to the county road. From there it angled toward a cluster of trees near an abandoned equipment shed on the far side of the property. We found where someone had parked a snowmobile in the ditch. The engine marks were partly filled with blown powder. The rider had walked from that point across the field to our yard. The tall shape I saw was a person standing still in the dark, dressed in heavy winter gear that blended into the night. The reason I did not see tracks at first was simple. The light angle and drifting snow hid the impressions until they deepened closer to the house. Under certain glare conditions, the surface looked smooth from a distance. The 6-foot stride came from someone deliberately stretching each step, likely to intimidate or to cover distance quickly without running. The depth suggested a large adult wearing insulated boots. The circling of the house was not random. The prints paused beneath each window. They stopped near the mudroom door longer than anywhere else. Later that week, the police identified a man who had been scouting rural properties in winter for fuel theft and equipment. He used a snowmobile to approach from fields where no one would see headlights from the road. He admitted to walking up to houses to check for activity before breaking into sheds or siphoning diesel. He denied planning to enter our home, but he had been charged in other cases. He was 6'4". I did not imagine the shape. It was a person testing whether anyone was inside. The isolation of that farmhouse made it an easy target. The cold made sound travel and air sharp. That night I learned how quickly distance disappears when someone decides to cross it. I stayed at my neighbor's place until my parents returned. The tracks remained visible for 3 days before the next snowfall buried them. Even after they were gone, I could still see the line in my mind, cutting across open land toward the house, steady and deliberate. My name is Ethan Clark. In February 2022, I was living alone in a second-floor apartment in southeast Portland. The building was older, built sometime in the 70s, with narrow hallways and thin walls. Most of the units faced the street, but mine sat on the back corner, looking over a long service alley that ran behind the block. The alley was used by garbage trucks, delivery vans, and sometimes people who didn't want to be seen. I was working remotely that week. My company had closed the office after a COVID exposure, and I took the chance to stay home and catch up on work without the commute. My routine was simple. Wake up, coffee, laptop at the small table near the living room window. Work through the day. Order food or cook something basic. Shower late at night. Sleep. Repeat. The apartment itself was quiet. Too quiet sometimes. The walls were painted off-white, and the floors were thin laminate that creaked near the kitchen. The bathroom sat along the back wall, the side that faced the alley. It had a small frosted glass window above the tub. The glass was textured enough that you couldn't see through it clearly, only shapes and movement. I never thought much about it. It was high enough that no one should be able to reach it. The first night I noticed the shadow, it was almost midnight. I had worked late, lost track of time, and went to shower before bed. The alley behind the building had a single security light mounted on a pole. It cast a dull yellow glow that sometimes filtered through the frosted glass. I was rinsing shampoo out of my hair when I saw movement on the window. A dark shape crossed slowly from left to right. It looked like a person passing close to the glass. The shadow stretched, then disappeared. I didn't react at first. The alley was used by maintenance workers and sometimes by people cutting through the block. I assumed someone had walked past the building or maybe leaned something against the wall. The thought lasted only a few seconds. The shape had been higher than a normal person's head, but I told myself the light outside could distort angles. I finished the shower and went to bed without checking. The next day I barely thought about it. Work was heavy, and I spent most of the day on calls. That night, around the same time, I went back into the bathroom. I turned on the shower, let the water warm, and stepped in. The shadow came back. This time it did not pass quickly. It appeared at the center of the glass and stayed there. The shape was human. Shoulders. A head. Still. I froze under the water. The figure shifted slightly, just enough to change the outline. Then it moved away. I stood there for a long time after that, listening. The bathroom fan was running, and the water covered most sound. When I shut everything off, the apartment felt too quiet. I told myself it had to be a neighbor from another building. Maybe a ladder for maintenance. Maybe someone working on wiring or pipes. But the building layout came back to me slowly. That wall had no exterior access. Behind it was a narrow gap between buildings, less than 3 feet wide in some places, then the alley beyond. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing mounted to the wall. I dried off, dressed, and went to the living room. I stood by the back window and looked down into the alley. The security light buzzed faintly. Trash bins sat along the wall. Nothing else. No equipment. No vehicles. I went to bed uneasy, but convinced myself I was overreacting. The third night I delayed the shower. I kept working until almost midnight, hoping the routine change would break whatever pattern I thought I was seeing. When I finally went into the bathroom, I left the main lights off and turned on only the small vanity light. The window looked darker that way. I stepped into the tub, but did not turn on the water. The shadow appeared almost immediately. It moved up from below the window, slowly, like someone climbing. The outline of a head rose into view. Then shoulders. Then it stopped, centered on the glass. This time it stayed for several seconds. I backed out of the bathroom without making noise. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my neck. I grabbed my phone and went to the living room window again. The alley looked empty. I stared for a full minute, scanning every corner. Then I noticed something near the wall beneath my bathroom window. A shape leaned against the building at an angle. It was a ladder. It was tall enough to reach the second-floor window. I didn't go outside that night. I locked the front door and pushed a chair under the handle. I stayed awake on the couch with the lights on until morning. At first light, I went down the back stairs and into the alley. The ladder was gone. There were marks on the ground where it had rested. Scuffed dirt. A shallow groove near the wall. I looked up at the bathroom window. From below, the glass sat just above eye level if someone stood on the top few rungs. The realization settled slowly. Someone had placed a ladder in the alley, climbed it, stood there long enough to watch. I went back upstairs and covered the window with a thick towel, taping the edges so nothing showed through. That day I contacted the property manager. I reported the ladder, the shadows, everything. Maintenance checked the alley and said nothing was stored there. No contractors were scheduled. No repairs had been ordered. I also installed a small motion camera inside the bathroom, aimed at the window. The next 2 nights, nothing happened. On the 3rd night, around 11:50 p.m., my phone alerted me. The camera had detected motion. I opened the live feed. The bathroom was dark except for the faint glow from the alley light. The frosted glass showed a shape rising slowly into frame. The figure paused at the center, exactly where I had seen it before. It stayed there for nearly 30 seconds. Then it lowered out of view. I called the police immediately. This time I went outside with them when they arrived. The ladder was back, positioned carefully under the window. Fresh shoe prints showed in the damp dirt behind it, leading toward the far end of the alley where it connected to the street. Officers followed the prints and found a parked van around the corner. Inside the van were tools, binoculars, and a notebook. The notebook contained dates and times. Several entries matched the nights I had been home. The man was found sleeping inside. He had been working nearby on a renovation project and had noticed the frosted window weeks earlier. He admitted he used the ladder to look inside at night. He chose late hours when the alley was empty. He said he watched from outside for several days before bringing the ladder. After the arrest, the property manager replaced the bathroom window with a solid pane and installed a metal barrier on the exterior. Motion lights were added along the alley. I stayed in the apartment for another month, but my routine never returned. Every sound from the alley pulled my attention. Every night I checked the window twice before sleeping. The part that stayed with me was not the ladder or the van or the notebook. It was the timing. He had learned my schedule. He knew when the bathroom light would come on. He knew when I would be alone. And for several nights before I ever noticed the shadow, someone had been standing less than 2 feet from the glass, watching me through a window I thought no one could reach. I moved into the apartment in August, right when the heat in Phoenix feels like it presses down on everything. The breakup had been sudden and quiet. 1 week I was packing shared dishes into boxes. The next I was signing a lease alone. I wanted a place that felt small and manageable, something I could control. The building was older but clean. 2 floors, outdoor walkways, beige walls faded by sun. My unit sat at the far end of the 2nd floor. The landlord told me the previous tenant had left quickly for a job out of state. He said a cleaning crew had already taken care of the place. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. Nothing looked damaged. Nothing looked strange. I signed the papers the same day. Living alone felt quiet in a way I had not expected. Every sound carried. The refrigerator hum at night. The air conditioner kicking on. Footsteps from the unit below. I kept the television on most evenings just to fill the space. The first week, I noticed mail in the box that did not belong to me. Letters addressed to a man named Carlos. Bank envelopes. Store flyers. A few packages left near the building entrance. I wrote "Return to Sender" on most of it and dropped it back into the outgoing slot. I assumed it would stop once the address changed in whatever system still had his name. It did not stop. Every few days there was something new. Some pieces looked important. 1 envelope from a hospital. 1 from a collections agency. The volume made me uneasy, like the apartment still had a connection to someone who was supposed to be gone. Inside the unit, small details made me aware that I was not the first person there. A faint rectangle on the wall where a large frame had hung. Screw holes near the entry where something heavy had once been mounted. A shelf in the hall closet that held a single plastic hanger I had missed during cleaning. None of it was alarming. It just gave the space a feeling of recent use, like it had not been empty long enough to settle. By the 3rd week, I had built a routine. I came home from work around 6, locked the door, set my bag on the kitchen counter, and checked the deadbolt twice. The door had a standard knob lock and a single deadbolt. No chain, no extra latch. I thought about asking for one, but kept putting it off. One evening, around 6:30, I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when I heard the front door open. The sound was clear. The click of the latch. The slow push of the door against the wall stop. For a moment I stood still, hands wet, mind trying to place the noise. I had locked that door when I came in. I always did. I stepped into the living room and saw a man halfway inside the apartment. He was carrying 2 grocery bags. He looked up and froze at the same time I did. He did not look threatening. Mid-30s, average build, wearing work clothes. But the fact that he had opened my door without knocking made the air feel thin. He stepped back immediately, confusion on his face, and looked at the door, then at me, then at the key still in his hand. He said nothing. I said nothing. After a few seconds, he closed the door and left. I stood there for a long time before I moved. My hands were shaking enough that I had to sit down. I locked the knob and the deadbolt again, then pulled a chair against the door. When I checked the peephole, the walkway was empty. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord's office. I explained what had happened. He looked surprised but not alarmed. He said the previous tenant must have forgotten to return all the keys. He said he would look into it. That answer did not sit right. I asked if the locks had been changed when the last tenant moved out. He hesitated before saying they usually did that if requested. I asked again more directly. Had the locks been changed? They had not. The previous tenant had lived there for 3 years. According to the landlord, he had moved out quickly and dropped off one key. No one had asked about extras. No one had replaced the hardware. The unit had been cleaned and listed immediately. I requested a lock change that day and paid the fee myself just to make sure it was done. The maintenance worker replaced the knob and deadbolt that afternoon. He handed me 2 new keys and said the old ones would no longer work. For a few days, I felt better. I added a doorstop at night and bought a simple camera for the living room that faced the entry. I told myself the incident had been a mistake. Someone who thought he still lived there. Then the mail increased again. Not just letters, small packages. Food delivery flyers with handwritten notes. One evening, a delivery driver knocked and held out a bag with the old tenant's name. I refused it, but the situation made something clear. The man who had lived there before had not just left keys with one person. He had given them to many. I contacted the landlord again and asked if they knew how many duplicates might exist. They did not. They admitted the previous tenant had a large social circle and often had guests. The thought settled in slowly. Before the locks were changed, anyone with an old key could have entered. At any time. While I was at work. While I was sleeping. I went through the apartment carefully that night. Closets. Cabinets. Storage areas. I checked for missing items, but could not be sure. I had not owned much after the breakup. Still, the feeling that someone might have been inside without my knowledge stayed with me. A week later, the camera recorded movement near the door around midday. I was at work. The footage showed someone trying the handle several times. The deadbolt held. The person left after a few seconds. The camera angle did not show the face clearly, only a shoulder and part of a cap. I showed the video to the landlord and asked about building security. There was none. No cameras in the hallways. No controlled entry to the property. That was the point where the apartment stopped feeling like a fresh start and started feeling exposed. I added a second interior lock and a door bar that braced against the floor. I installed a small motion sensor near the entry. I redirected all mail for the previous tenant through the postal service. I reported the attempted entry to the non-emergency police line so there would be a record. Over the next month, the unwanted mail slowed. No more delivery attempts. No more movement at the door. The camera stayed quiet. Eventually, I learned from a neighbor that the former tenant had given keys to friends for parties and short stays. Some of them had used the apartment even when he was traveling. Many of them had never returned their copies when he moved. The man who walked in with groceries likely believed he still had access. Others may have tried the same after hearing the tenant had left. I stayed in that apartment for another year, but I never relaxed the way I had planned to when I signed the lease. Every lock was checked. Every sound was noticed. Living alone did not feel peaceful. It felt like a responsibility that required constant attention. The experience changed how I approached any new place. Now I never assume locks have been replaced. I never trust a landlord's general assurance. Hardware gets changed before the first night. Extra security goes in immediately. What unsettled me most was not the man who walked in. It was the realization that, for weeks before that evening, the apartment might never have been truly empty. I rented the cabin because I needed quiet. The place sat deep in the Appalachian Hills, at the end of a narrow gravel road that turned to packed dirt for the last half-mile. No neighbors, no power lines in sight, just trees, sloped ground, and a long view of ridges fading into blue distance. The owner told me there was no cell service, and the nearest town was about 25 minutes away. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived in early June. The air smelled like leaves and damp earth. The cabin was small but solid, built from old timber, with a metal roof and a wide front porch. There was a well, a propane stove, and a small generator I planned to use only if needed. Most of my work would be done on a laptop with long battery life and a stack of notebooks. The first 2 days were quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy at first, then normal. During the day, I wrote on the porch. At night, I kept the windows open and listened to insects and wind moving through the trees. Sometimes I heard something large walking far off in the woods. Deer, most likely. Once I saw a black bear across the slope, moving slowly and ignoring me. Nothing about the area felt dangerous. Just remote. On the third night, I stayed up late working. I had fallen into a rhythm and did not want to stop. Around 3 a.m., while I was at the small table near the front window, I heard 3 knocks on the front door. They were clear, slow and firm. Not loud, but deliberate. At first I thought I imagined it. I sat still and listened. The woods were quiet. No footsteps. No engine sound. No voices. I got up and walked to the door. The porch light was off, so I turned it on and opened the door. No one was there. The porch was empty. The dirt in front of the steps looked undisturbed. The road was dark and still. I stood there for a minute, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. I told myself it could have been a branch shifting or the wood settling. Cabins make sounds at night. I shut the door, locked it, and went back to work. After a while, I stopped thinking about it. The next evening was normal. I worked most of the day, took a short walk near sunset, and came back before dark. The air had turned thick and warm. I left the back window open to let some air move through. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint scraping sound. It came from the back wall, near the corner where the kitchen met the bedroom. The sound was light, like something dragging slowly across the wood. Then it stopped. Then it came again, a little higher. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside through the back door. The beam moved across the wall, the ground, and the nearby trees. Nothing. No animal. No broken branches. The dirt behind the cabin was soft and bare, but I saw no fresh tracks. I stood there long enough for the insects to start sounding loud again. Then I went back inside and locked the door. Around 3 a.m., I heard the scraping again. Same area. Same slow pattern. I sat on the bed and listened. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I walked over and pressed my hand against the wall where the sound had been. The wood felt solid. On impulse, half out of frustration, half out of nerves, I knocked on the wall 3 times. The sound came back immediately. 3 knocks. Sharp. From the opposite side of the cabin. Not from outside the same wall. From the far wall, near the front of the building. I froze. The distance was too far for it to be an echo. It sounded like someone had hit the front wall from outside at the same moment I knocked. I did not move for a long time. The cabin felt small and thin. Every board seemed exposed. I checked the front door again. Locked. I looked through the window. The porch was empty. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, listening. About 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps. They were slow and heavy, moving through the dirt around the cabin. Not the quick, light steps of a deer. Not the rustle of something small. These sounded like weight shifting on soil. A step. A pause. Another step. The movement circled the building. I tracked it by sound as it passed the side wall, then the back, then the other side. It stopped near the front door. Nothing happened for a while. Then the steps moved away again. This went on for hours. The pattern never changed. Slow walking. A full circle. A long pause. Then another circle. I did not open the door. I did not turn the lights back on. I sat in a chair with a flashlight and waited for daylight. At some point the sound stopped. I must have fallen asleep without realizing it, because when I opened my eyes the cabin was bright with morning light. The first thing I did was go outside and check the ground. The dirt around the cabin was smooth. No footprints. No tracks. No disturbed patches. The soil was dry and soft enough that any animal heavier than a raccoon would have left marks. I walked the full perimeter twice. Nothing. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Sound travels strangely in the hills. Maybe the noise came from the road or from animals moving farther away than I thought. Maybe the ground was harder than it looked. Still, I did not feel the same after that. I spent the next day working, but I kept checking the windows. That night I moved a heavy chair against the front door and kept the flashlight beside the bed. At 3 a.m., almost to the minute, I heard 3 knocks again. Front door. Same spacing. Same force. I did not get up. About 5 minutes later, the footsteps began. This time I forced myself to stay calm and listen carefully. The pattern was steady. Each step had a slight crunch, but there was also a faint metallic rattle mixed in, like something loose striking against a hard surface. The sound grew clearer when it passed the side near the generator shed. I stayed awake until morning again. After sunrise, I went straight to the shed. The small generator sat on a wooden platform next to a metal fuel can. The can had been moved slightly, just enough that its handle rested against the generator frame. When I touched it, it made the same metallic rattle I had heard during the night. The ground around the shed showed fresh deer tracks. Several sets, deep and clear. The area behind the cabin had more tracks too. They had been there before, but I had not looked closely enough in the early light. The knocking made sense once I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The porch roof hung low, and a loose section of trim along the edge had come free on one side. In the wind, it swung inward and tapped the door frame 3 times in a row when the gusts hit just right. That night, the wind picked up after midnight. I stood inside and watched through the window. When the trim swung, it struck the frame 3 times, evenly spaced, the sound traveling through the wood and echoing like a knock. The scraping on the back wall came from the same deer. They had been rubbing their antlers against the cabin's rough boards. Early summer is when bucks start that behavior. The reason I heard the response from the opposite wall when I knocked was simple too. The cabin was built from old timber and sat on a raised foundation. The boards carried vibration easily. When I hit one wall, the sound traveled through the frame and struck the siding on the other side with a sharp echo. What had frightened me was the timing. I knocked hard enough that the loose trim outside the front caught the movement from the vibration and swung inward at the same moment. Nothing had knocked back. The footsteps that circled for hours were deer moving along their regular path around the clearing, drawn by the well and the open space. The ground looked smooth in the morning because much of the area near the porch had been packed hard by years of use. I had checked the wrong spots in poor light. After fixing the loose trim and moving the fuel can away from the generator, the nights were quiet again. I stayed for another week. The deer kept passing through, sometimes close enough that I could see them in the early morning mist. Even after I understood everything, I still woke up a few times around 3 a.m., listening for 3 knocks that never came back. In April 2019, I agreed to house sit for a co-worker named Eric while he was on his honeymoon. I barely knew him. We worked in different departments in the same office building in Columbus, Ohio. We had spoken a few times in the break room. He knew I lived 10 minutes from his place, and that I did not have any travel plans that month. He said he did not want the house empty for 2 weeks. He had just moved in the year before. It was a new build in a quiet subdivision on the north side of the city. Clean sidewalks, evenly spaced trees, identical mailboxes. The kind of neighborhood where porch lights turn on at the same time each evening. The house had smart locks on both doors, a doorbell camera, and 2 motion cameras covering the driveway and backyard. He showed me the app on his phone, then helped me install it on mine. He said I would get alerts if anything moved after dark. He seemed proud of the setup. He said it made him feel safe. He kept a spare key in a kitchen drawer in case the lock battery ever died. He showed me that too. He slid open the top right drawer next to the stove and pointed at a small plastic tray beside a set of measuring spoons. The key had a blue rubber cover on the head. The first night was calm. I brought a duffel bag, some groceries, and my laptop. I locked the door from the inside around 9. I walked through each room once before settling in. The house had that new construction smell, dry wood and fresh paint. The basement was unfinished. Concrete floor, exposed beams, 1 small window near the ceiling. A thin layer of gray dust coated the floor around the water heater and furnace. At around 10:15 p.m., I was on the couch scrolling through emails when I heard a soft electronic chirp from the front hallway. It was a quick sequence of beeps, the same sound the keypad made when someone entered the code. My body reacted before my mind did. I froze and listened. I expected to hear the click of the deadbolt retracting. I did not hear it, only silence. I stood up and walked to the front door. The handle was still in the locked position. The deadbolt was extended. I opened the app on my phone. It showed the door is locked. I checked the activity log. No unlock recorded. No failed attempt. Nothing at 10:15. The last entry was me locking it at 9:02 p.m. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe the lock had a software hiccup. Maybe a low battery. I checked the battery status. It read 90%. I stood there for a minute, looking at the door, listening for any movement outside. The porch light cast a clear circle on the concrete. No shadows moved. I returned to the couch, but did not relax. I kept thinking about the sound. It had been distinct. Not random noise. Not a creak. A digital tone. Around 10:30, I went into the kitchen to get water. I remembered the spare key in the drawer. I do not know why I thought of it. I just wanted to confirm it was there. I opened the top right drawer. The measuring spoons were in the tray. The rubber bands and takeout menus were in the back. The space beside the tray was empty. I pulled the drawer all the way out and looked behind it. Nothing. I checked the other drawers. I checked the counter. I looked in the small bowl near the sink where loose change sat. The key was not anywhere in the kitchen. I tried to replay the memory of Eric showing it to me. I could see his hand lifting the key with the blue cover. I could see him putting it back. I was sure it had been in that drawer when I arrived. I had opened it earlier to look for a corkscrew. I would have noticed if it was missing. A tight feeling settled in my chest. The beeping sound and the missing key connected in a way that felt direct and simple. Someone had entered before I arrived, or someone knew exactly where that key was kept. At 10:40 p.m. my phone vibrated. Motion detected in backyard. I opened the notification immediately. The live feed tried to load. A spinning icon appeared on the screen. The image froze on a grainy view of the fence and a patch of grass. The timestamp in the corner stopped updating. I exited and reopened the app. The same frozen frame appeared. The driveway camera still worked. The doorbell camera still worked. Only the backyard feed was unresponsive. I walked toward the back of the house slowly. The lights inside were on, which made it hard to see outside through the glass. I turned off the kitchen light and let my eyes adjust. The yard was dark. The fence line was still. No movement that I could see. Then I heard a dull sound from below. A light thud. It came from the basement area, near the back wall where the exterior basement door was located. That door led up a short concrete stairwell to ground level. It was meant for emergency access and lawn equipment. Eric had shown it to me. He said he never used it. I stood in the kitchen listening. Another sound followed. A slow pressure against the basement door from the inside. The faint rattle of the handle moving. Not from outside trying to get in. From inside trying to get out. The realization hit in a single wave. Someone was already in the basement. I did not go downstairs. I did not investigate. I backed away from the kitchen and moved toward the stairs leading up to the second floor. My hands were steady, but my breathing had changed. I locked the interior door at the top of the stairs, then went into the main bathroom and locked that too. It had no windows. I sat on the edge of the tub and called 911. While waiting, I could hear faint movement below. Not constant. Occasional shifting. A scrape. A small impact against wood. Whoever it was did not rush. That disturbed me more than noise would have. It suggested patience. The police arrived within minutes. I heard heavy steps inside the house and loud commands. The sounds in the basement stopped. After several more minutes, an officer knocked on the bathroom door and identified himself. I unlocked it with shaking hands. They had cleared the house. No one was inside by the time they searched. The basement exterior door was unlocked. The spare key with the blue rubber cover was in the exterior lock, inserted from the outside. The ground outside that door showed fresh dirt impressions. Clear shoe prints leading to the stairwell and back out again. The dust on the basement floor showed partial prints near the water heater. The officers explained the likely sequence. Someone had taken the spare key at some point before I arrived. They had either watched Eric hide it or entered previously and found it. That night, they used it to enter through the basement door while I was upstairs. When they realized I was still in the house and active, they attempted to leave quietly. The beeping at the front door was probably an attempt to test the smart lock code earlier, to see if access was possible without the key. The missing app log suggested they never successfully unlocked the front door. The backyard camera feed had been disrupted by a weak signal. The officer checked the router in the living room. It had been partially unplugged, enough to weaken the Wi-Fi connection to the back of the house, but not enough to shut it down completely. That explained the frozen feed. The intruder likely fled through the basement door when they heard me moving upstairs and then calling for help. The spare key was left in the lock in the rush to leave. Eric cut his honeymoon short and returned 2 days later. He replaced all the locks and moved the security equipment to a monitored service. The police later informed him that a man had been arrested in a nearby neighborhood for a series of similar entries. He targeted new homes with visible smart systems. He watched owners for weeks. He learned their routines. He preferred houses that were supposed to be empty. I moved back to my apartment the next afternoon. For weeks I replayed the sound of that keypad beep in my head. The technology had given a sense of control. In reality, it had created predictable habits. The spare key in the drawer was a single point of failure. The cameras depended on a signal that could be weakened by a loose cable. What unsettled me most was not the idea that someone had been in the basement. It was the fact that they knew where to look in the kitchen. That detail meant observation, time, planning. I no longer assume that a locked door and a notification on a phone equal safety. I assume someone can study patterns. I assume convenience hides weakness. That night did not involve force or broken glass. It involved access. That is what made it real.